I thought I had learned it all. I thought I had become a Gi. But I was wrong. I soon discovered that there was so much more. So much I didn't know. I had made sense of the incomprehensible. Or so I thought. I was merely scratching the surface. Little did I know, there was another disciple of the good word of Gi. His work called into question everything I thought I knew. But I wouldn't let it stop me. I will soon uncover his ways. Emulating Even Amundsen.
One of the key features of Even Amundsen's work that makes it so appealing is his ability to control lines. When drawing with lines, it's useful to use a variety of widths or line weights to your work. Lighter lines are useful for edges that are in highlight, while heavier lines are useful for indicating an edge that's in shadow or demonstrating overlapping. Notice how on this prism, I use heavier line weight towards the bottom. Since the most common lighting scenario is top lighting, as with sunlight or overhead lights, I tend to reserve these thicker lines for the bottom. I've discussed some draftsmanship exercises in previous videos, but a helpful exercise in improving your line work is creating 3 dots and connecting them in one smooth curve. Remember that when viewed head-on, a perfect circle placed within a square will touch the center of each edge. When we take that same plane and now tilt it in perspective, once again the circle needs to touch the center of each edge. The minor axis, drawn in red, will divide the ellipse along the shortest path and will head towards the vanishing point opposite of the plane. If we take this plane and tilt it forward along an elliptical path, we can create a new tilted plane in which to create an ellipse. The minor axis of this new ellipse is the tangent line of the elliptical path and the tilted plane. We can use these same principles to establish perspective in organic forms. In this first example, we can tell that the camera is positioned above the object because each ellipse curves downwards. Imagine that we're taking many paper-thin slices through this form, and then sticking a pin through the center of each one. And in the second example, each ellipse is curving upwards, which indicates that the camera is positioned below. Think of the minor axis like the handle of a top, or in my case, a pen poked through a paper plate. As I've mentioned before, there are several different types of lines. Contour lines, which are typically light in line weight and indicate a shift in plane. Hatching lines, which are used to create texture and value. And the heaviest lines are reserved for indicating when one object is in front of the other and when planes are in shadow. Amundsen will often use a great deal of hatching and heavy line weight to indicate cast shadows, which are the shadows projected when an object occludes incoming light. Each of the primitive forms will project a different shadow shape. This isn't a rendering tutorial, so I'm not going to go too much into specifics, but there's a few key considerations when determining the size and placement of your shadows. The first is the angle of light shining on the object, the second is the distance to the light source, and the third being the quality or type of light that's being shown. But we'll get more into that later. Since hatching is our main tool to demonstrate value with lines, we can use it to indicate our lighting conditions, materials, and textures. A matte surface, like the one I'm sketching here, is non-reflective and will disperse the light through its surface. The area of darkest value is known as the core shadow, and surprisingly, it's not located closest to the ground plane, because those areas are receiving light reflected from the ground surface. The location at which the shadow ends is known as the terminator. This is the point where you're going to see the most texture. A fully reflective material like chrome will project its surroundings on its surface. The dark spot on the bottom is its reflection of its own cast shadow. Chainmail has a lot of fine details, but it's still subject to lighting like a matte surface. So I begin by hatching in some values. Once I have some tone set in place, I use a series of C-shaped curves traveling along an elliptical path to demonstrate the texture. The eyeball reflects a lot of light because of its specularity, but it's still subject to some matte shading properties. There's a lot of overlapping forms and feathers, so I use a heavy line weight to indicate those cast shadows. Adding in some hatching, or even cross-hatching, indicates the values and also adds some texture to these feathers. And try to remain cognizant of directionality when you're hatching. You can make your lines parallel or convergent, but don't make them aimless and arbitrary. Since the ram horn is essentially a spiraling rectangular prism, I add in hatching on one side to indicate the plane shift. Notice how I use a heavy line weight on those overlapping forms to indicate that one is in front of the other. And also take note of how I leave a lot of rest areas in the highlights. I focus most of my details in the planes that are in shadow. Another key feature of Amundsen's drawings is his use of hatching to indicate light sources. One principle of rendering is that as a plane becomes increasingly parallel to the angle of light, the darker its value becomes. So as a result, planes that are parallel to our light source are darkest, and planes that are perpendicular are the brightest. Notice that the darkest areas have increased density of hatching lines. Even though I'm decreasing the space between these lines and including more of them, I make sure that every line is parallel to one another and that they're all parallel to the plane. This example probably should have gone in the previous section, but here I'm showing how a cast shadow is projected onto a curved surface. By mapping the center line of the top plane to that of the curved, I can map precisely where the shadow will land on the surface. Since we've started to go down this path of rendering, let's take a look at two different lighting scenarios. One where the lighting source is very close to the object, and one where it's very far away. Local lighting, such as candle lighting, is emitted radially and dissipates exponentially according to the inverse square law. In order to project a shadow from a local light source, create a guideline from the light to the ground plane, and then carry it through to the object. Then create a guideline emitting from the light that intersects the far edge and eventually touches the ground plane. Local light will produce shadows that have soft gradient edges. Direct lighting is what you encounter when you go out on a sunny day. This type of lighting produces very hard shadows. I'm creating guidelines emitting from the ground plane of the box. Where those lines make contact with the angles of light that touch the top edges of our form, our cast shadow will be created. Again, I'll cover these cast shadow projection methods more clearly in a rendering video. Alright, so let's put all these techniques together and draw a character. I skipped the posing of this character since that'll be the entirety of next week's video. But if you want to see some material on constructing the human form, take a look at the anatomy series. Take note of the circular element on the character's back, as well as those on his headpiece. These are a direct application of tilted ellipses and cast shadows demonstrated earlier. Here I'm adding in a flat value and a layer underneath to help separate out the character's silhouette. With most of the character fleshed out, now I can start to hatch in some of those textures and rendering information. Again, keep in mind that all of the hatching has a directionality to it, and it's not just done in an arbitrary way. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. If you like the video, please subscribe and consider supporting the channel on Patreon. We have a lot of really cool options, like access to the archive of full-length live streams, critiques during live streams, and group lessons. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'll be live every Friday through Sunday at 1 PM Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube. And be sure to head over to the Discord server to chat with some other artists and keep up to date with the channel. Alright, thanks guys.